Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 16th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about elite atmospheres in college football. They're all over the country every single year, but I think this year might just have more than we're expecting, and maybe more than previous years. Then we'll get into Miami and Mario Cristobal, a ton going into this year, and they pretty much have to deliver down there in Coral Gables, and if they do, then some special things could be happening down there. Then we'll get into recruiting, a ton of big-time recruiting updates. Bama continues to just go on an absolute tear on the recruiting trail. Want to break that down for you guys. We'll finish off the Impact Freshmen for today. We'll get into the ACC and finish out the Power 4 conferences. Before finishing it out today with a Top 10 Tuesday, we'll break down the biggest games, I think, for my preseason Top 10 teams. So we'll break down that all on today's show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here. You can ask something you're wondering about. You can use the GSMCpodcast.net. That is a huge help to not only us, but you guys as well. It's definitely a very, very cool thing for us to have kind of a interactive show here. Again, that's GSMCpodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's talk about why I think this year might just be different than every other year in college football when it comes to atmospheres. And this obviously is not a new thing. College football is defined by its fans. In my opinion, they're the best fans in the world. They're a little bit crazy at times, but that's all right. I think there's going to be a ton of really, really incredible atmospheres this year. And I think this was something that a lot of people, if I had said this 6 months ago, a year ago, some people probably would have laughed at me because of all the realignment, because of all the changes. But I really do think this is going to be a crazy year for atmospheres, and I think it could create just a wild, wild year in college football, kind of on the level of 2007, which is another conversation for another day. But there is so much going into this year, and I think when you look at the atmospheres that are coming up this upcoming year, I think the biggest thing that's affected it all is realignment. I think it's given us a couple of games this year that are going to be absolutely incredible. Now, losing Bedlam is obviously something that takes a big time hit to this, but at the end of the day, it is replaced with a ton of huge games. Obviously, not having the Apple Cup being having that being a non-con game takes a little bit away from that, but there will still be plenty of fire in that game. I can almost promise you that. But I do think there are a couple of games that I think really set this off in terms of realignment, at least. And that's obviously Ohio State at Oregon and then Georgia at Texas. I think both of those atmospheres could be the very best we've seen at both of those schools, Oregon and Texas, in quite some time. I think all of those fans are looking forward to that date more than maybe any other one on the calendar. I think especially for Oregon, but for Texas, maybe they're looking forward to OU or A&M or whatever. But at the end of the day, those places are going to be crazy. Both of those atmospheres are going to be off the charts insane. And I think when you have those big-time teams coming in for the first time ever, for the first time in a really long time in Oregon and Ohio State's case, there's going to be energy behind it. I just think this one is a little bit more aggressive because Oregon and Texas are coming in with championships on their mind. They're not necessarily coming in just to participate. They want to take over the conference. So this would obviously be a place to do that, and I think the atmosphere will reflect that, obviously. And then we talked about some of the rivalries that we would be losing this year. Well, we're getting a couple back, and I think that will definitely help some things. I think I've been trying to figure out what is going to be the atmosphere of the year as I was kind of putting this together, trying to figure out, what's the game that's going to stand out above the pack. I tend to believe it's going to be Texas at Texas A&M at the end of the year. I think that one's going to be different than every single other game up until that point. I think it's going to be absolutely on fire. They've been waiting about 13 years at this point for this game to happen, and I think that place is going to be absolutely crazy. I've talked about it before, but the people that constructed Kyle Field might just want to think about reinforcing that thing just a little bit before that game because that place is going to be on fire. Then you have Oklahoma, Missouri, which is another great one. Texas against Arkansas, which we saw up close and personal in 2020. There's tons of games that are going to be huge for just kind of this new era of college football. You're bringing back some games that we lost in the past, and definitely the passion will be right back to where it used to be. That's for sure. And then obviously another thing kind of helping this out is the expanded playoff. There's a couple of games in that late November era where maybe that, 5-win team or that 4-win team is not quite as interested as they would be this year, because there's someone coming in trying to win a national title, trying to get to the playoff, or they're trying to get to the playoff and they want all the fans be there and be involved. So after about week 9, I think there's going to be a huge move on all of this stuff, and there's going to be a couple of games where maybe it's not the most interesting game on paper, but it's still going to be on fire when they go into that atmosphere. And I think week 12 is really the area that I've seen this kind of bear itself out the most. And it starts with Clemson traveling to Pitt. That's going to be a relatively benign game. At least that's what it looks like as of right now. But the reality is, I think Clemson is in a position where they could be heading on to an ACC title, could be undefeated at the time, could be going to a playoff, and Pitt really wants to screw that up. I still think Clemson is the team in this conference that has the biggest target on its back, but Florida State is definitely catching up to them rather quickly. But I do think Clemson is the team that everyone wants to beat, that everyone wants to knock down, and I think that travel to Pitt could just be that moment where Clemson might just stumble a little bit. And then also you have Utah-Colorado is another one that I'm watching very closely on the exact same day. Oh, excuse me, I apologize for that. But I do think there is going to be a ton of energy around that game. The Buffs could be making history and going into a Big 12 title run possibly, or they could be looking for their 6th win still. Utah would likely be looking towards a playoff, Pac-12 foes. Everything is going into this game just being absolutely insane. Oregon at Wisconsin is that same week. I think that one's going to be absolutely wild, be one of those that we're going to look back on, and it could just get a little bit more intense and sketchy for Oregon than they expect it to be, because there's a couple of games right after that are going to be really tough to deal with for Oregon. And then you have Texas going to Arkansas. We talked about it earlier. This is a game that's going to be crazy. It was crazy in 2021 when they traveled there, and Texas just got absolutely railroaded really by Arkansas that day. But the reality is there's going to be energy behind this one, because Arkansas fans do not like Texas fans one bit. I can promise you that. So there's going to be a lot of energy around that one. I think week 12 is that week where you might just see a couple of atmospheres where you turn on the TV and you realize, wow, this is crazier in Pittsburgh than I thought it was going to be, or it's crazier in Boulder, it's crazier in Fayetteville than I expected it to be this weekend. I think that's kind of just the playoff doing what it was intended to do, which is open up a lot of these late week games that might not seem too interesting at face value, become a little bit more interesting because maybe one team is trying to make the playoff, one team is trying to ruin that team's chances of getting in. So I think that will definitely help. And then finally, the death of divisions has done a ton of work here. I think that's definitely played a huge part in all this. You're getting some games that we used to not really get in some of these conferences, mainly the SEC and the Big Ten this year. But I think getting UGA and Bama is absolutely huge. Those two teams should be playing way more often than they do right now. And I think getting them as quick as on the schedule as much as possible is absolutely huge. Missouri also playing Auburn more often, I think will be a really fun one. They've only played 3 times since Missouri joined in 2020 in 2013 or 2011, excuse me. And one of those times was in the title game in 2013. So obviously this is something that it happens in the SEC more than some other places I've noticed, but the reality is you want all these teams playing as many different opponents as possible. I think the conferences should be rotating every 2 years if you could. Obviously, there's a ton of teams in the league, so that makes it a little bit more tough. But at least, be a rotating cast where you don't play anyone twice until you've played another team, unless you have those every year opponents like Texas OU or UGA Florida. Those games absolutely will stay, but I think you have to find a way to rotate through all of these games, and I think not having divisions absolutely helps that. And then maybe at some point we'll even get UGA heading out to A&M to play a game, because they have not yet since A&M has joined, and I believe they've only played once since A&M has joined the conference. So very weird out there, but the reality is atmospheres are the best thing about the sport. Period. End of story. I think this is what makes this sport special, is the fans in that crowd getting together every Saturday in the fall for about 4 hours and frankly just losing their minds. Collectively just all losing their minds at different moments, and that's what makes this sport special. That's what makes it stand out, in my opinion. And I think this year might just be a little bit more special in that respect. I think there's games that a lot of people aren't looking at. I think there's games that are more important now than they used to be. I think when you look at the SEC in particular, Bama's going into every single game as probably the team that everyone wants to beat the most. I'm just being totally honest. With Saban gone and everyone wanting to knock Bama off that pedestal, that's the team that everyone wants to beat. And I think that's going to add to some of these atmospheres like Tennessee, which is already going to be off the walls. Auburn, same exact thing. But I still think you're going to get a couple of games where you turn it on and you go, man, this crowd is really, really into it. And it's because when you can knock off a team that has controlled college football for the last 14 years, you're going to take that opportunity, that's for sure. So I think there's going to be an incredible amount of games, whether it's, old hatreds being renewed like Texas and Texas A&M, or Oklahoma and Missouri, or it's new ones forming like Oregon and Ohio State, or Penn State USC is an interesting one that I think could kind of develop. I think USC just hosting Big Ten teams is going to be a really interesting one because not necessarily known for a great atmosphere out there in the Coliseum, but if they want to compete in the Big Ten, it better be pretty soon. So that'll be a really, really fun thing to watch. I think I've named a number of games that are going to have great atmospheres, and that doesn't include the rivalries that we've seen for years now. The Texas OU one that I personally believe is the best in the game. Obviously, Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn. You have UGA, Florida. They're just amazing rivalries all across the sport, but I think some of the other games are going to have that extra energy, and then you'll still have the whiteout. You'll still have a checkered kneel-in game. You'll still have the OK State fans just banging the wall with those sticks. You'll have everything that makes college football special, but I think you'll just have it in more games this year. I think you'll just see it around the country a little bit more often, and I, for one, just absolutely love that. So I think 2024 is going to be special for about a million different reasons. I think it's going to be a very, very big year for the sport for 1,000 different ways that I can go about that, but I think the atmospheres are going to be really, really special, and I think we could look back on this year and say, this had some of the best atmospheres I've ever seen as a college football fan, but we'll see how that develops, obviously. It would be a great thing to see happen, but it definitely will be interesting to see some of these new teams face off and how that atmosphere kind of manifests itself during that time. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Miami. A huge year coming up for the Hurricanes and Mario Cristobal. How do they execute, and can they deliver on those big-time expectations? Well, I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about some of the atmospheres we're going to see this year and how I think this year might just be a little bit more special than normal years, and normal years are already pretty special when you talk about atmospheres in college football. But let's move right along here and let's talk about Miami and Mario Cristobal, because this is the year, period, end of story. This is the year that Miami needs to make a lot of things happen. We talked about it a little bit earlier where he's kind of, Mario Cristobal that is kind of on the same wavelength as Ryan Day right this second. Obviously, a little bit less pressure over in Miami than is up in Columbus right now, but it doesn't change that they need to deliver this year, and doesn't change that they absolutely need to find their way up to the top of this conference and possibly even win it this year, because a lot of stuff is in place. As you've known, I'm sure, throughout this offseason, Miami is one of the biggest winners. There's no two ways about it. I think Miami had a huge offseason. I think Ohio State obviously is the biggest offseason winner of the bunch, but Miami's coming into this year with as much hype as really anyone. They upgraded everywhere, and mainly that guy right there, Cam Ward, coming in was a huge win. I think Florida State was very much after him, and stealing him from them was absolutely huge for this program. He's someone that can absolutely elevate your team and just make them that much better, make them that much more dangerous on the offensive side of the ball, which is honestly where I thought Miami was just a little bit stagnant last season. Not that they were bad on the offensive side of the ball. I think they did some nice things, but they didn't have that thing. They didn't have that spark that made defenses worried about that deep ball or about that quarterback getting out of the pocket and making something happen. That's going to be the case for Cam Ward, and it's going to be really interesting to see what Miami can do, but I understand the lofty expectations for Miami. There's no two ways about it. There's a remarkably talented team in a really wide open conference this year. But at the same time, I do think Mario Cristobal's on schedule. I think he's doing things at the pace that you should expect him to do it. I think there's a lot of things happening in Miami behind the scenes, whether you talk about the infrastructure that's being set up, the NIL game, they're playing really, really well right now, and just recruiting overall has been just at a higher level than it was in the past for Miami since Mario Cristobal has come in. So part of me wants to say, let's let him take his time. If he goes 9 or 10 wins or even 9 wins this upcoming year, that's a huge win, and frankly, that's probably the way that I would view it. But at the end of the day, Miami wants to win an ACC title. I think every Miami fan would tell you that is priority number one, and it's because of that guy. It's because Cam Ward came into this program and turned it on its head pretty much overnight, because that's what they needed. They needed a difference maker at quarterback. They had a lot of things in place a year ago, and not to take anything away from Tyler Van Dyke, but when you have a guy that can extend plays, that can make things happen with his legs, it just adds a different vibe to your offense that didn't exist necessarily when Tyler Van Dyke was there. But when you look up and down this roster beyond Cam Ward, it's insanely talented. You have guys like Jacoby George. You have Xavier Restrepo, who is one of the best wide receivers in the entire country. Adding Sam Brown from Houston was huge. And then you'll probably have to have some younger guys make some plays. Nye Carter is someone I'm watching very closely. Josiah Trader, another one. The running back room is off the charts good. Damian Martinez leading it, coming over from Oregon State. But you also have Mark Fletcher Jr. You also have an offensive line that is just ridiculous, led by Francis Mauanoa, who is an awesome junior who I think is going to do just great work this upcoming year. Junior or sophomore? One of the two. I cannot remember right this second. But a very talented kid nonetheless, and someone that is going to be a linchpin on that offensive line. Brought in Zach Carpenter from Indiana at center just to kind of shore up that offensive line. And if you've seen Mario Cristobal's O-lines over the years, they're very physical groups. Now, some have missed the mark because of personnel. I don't think that's going to be the issue for this one, at least outwardly the issue. You won't necessarily notice it too much. But then on the defense, they did work in the portal. There's no two ways about that. Simeon Barrow Jr. coming over from Michigan State was the biggest pickup likely. But then you also got Michelle Powell from Washington, who's a fantastic safety. You have Tyler Barron and Elijah Alston off the edge, who are huge. Jalen Alderman in the middle of the field. Everything is being led by new faces on that defensive side of the ball, which can make you a little bit nervous. But at the end of the day, I think the roots are solid, which is the really important part. And we talked about Francis Mauanoa. How about Francisco Mauanoa, a really solid linebacker that I think will be the anchor of that defense, a very important guy. And then Ruben Bain, the guy on your screen, I think is the best player on this team. I think he's huge for this team and is set up to have as big a year as really any pass rusher in the entire country. You also have Xavier Restrepo, obviously we talked about, and then Francis Mauanoa. So the roots are really solid. It's just the trappings that are a little bit different, and obviously Cam Ward being one of the roots, that's a little bit new. But at the end of the day, I do think this program is in a position where they can have a couple of things go not so great with this transfer portal class and still be able to backfill. It'll just be backfilling with some younger players than they would probably like. So the roster's taken care of. They'll be more than fine taking care of the schedule in front of them with the guys that they have. But that's the thing that has separated. Miami has always had a little bit of talent. Now, the talent level has definitely ramped up over the last couple of years. There's no two ways about that. But at the end of the day, what are the hinge points for this year? What are the areas where if they don't hit, if they don't go Miami's way, they're going to kind of tumble a little bit this year instead of rocketing to the top of the sport. First of all, we've talked about it a lot. Cam Ward's got to be special. I don't think there's a world where he can just execute, if I'm being totally honest. I think they can have a really potent offense if he were to just execute, but I think for this team to do what they want to do, win the ACC, to win 10 games, to go to the playoff, he's got to be special. He's got to be that player that they brought him in to be, and he's got to be the guy that everyone wanted out of the portal and was flirting with the NFL draft. So a lot of this stuff has to happen for Miami, and that's why you brought Cam Ward in. Period. End of story. That's the reason that he is in those colors right now, and he's got to execute at a really, really high level. And then the other thing that I noticed last season that was kind of frustrating because you were watching this team, there's so much ability on the field, but the offensive play calling just has to be better. I really like Shannon Dawson, and I think he's going to do a really good job this upcoming year because I think Cam Ward fits him a little bit better. But at the end of the day, there were some times where the play calling was just weird. It was all over the place. It didn't necessarily have a rhythm. They didn't let anyone really get into a flow of the game by any means. So that was really the biggest worry for me, and I think it's something that obviously Cam Ward helps that a ton because he makes some bad play calls look really good at the end of the day, but also you got to make sure you're running a fluid offense, an efficient offense, and that's something that Miami's just got to take that next step to do. It's not necessarily a huge overhaul or fix or anything, but just kind of dial in more stuff and make it a more streamlined process, I suppose. And then finally, I think the defensive front is huge. They might be the most important part of this team because that's where you've kind of made the difference this upcoming season. That's where you've made the biggest splash, in my opinion, in terms of what you had last season and what you have now, probably outside of quarterback. But you have Simeon Barrow Jr., you have CJ Clark, who are going to carry a ton of weight. They are going to be the starters at those positions, and Barrow Jr. is a known commodity coming from Michigan State. CJ Clark a little bit less so, coming from a little bit lower ranks, but still a very talented kid. I do think we're going to see some very young kids like Armando Blunt and Justin Scott and some of these really younger kids that are very talented, but they're going to be thrust into action pretty soon and pretty early, and they're going to have to be ready to roll. And then finally, the biggest one for this team is just handling the hype. There is going to be a lot of stuff that is talking about Miami throughout the season, going into the season, and then if they win a couple of games early on, it'll go through the roof. There will be people talking about this team as a playoff contender, as the ACC favorite, as a national title contender. So many things will be put on this team's shoulders, and they got to handle it because pretty much no one in that locker room has been at that level, has been at that college football level where they've been the team to beat in a conference, where they've been the team with the biggest target on their back. So they're going to have to be ready to roll. There's no two ways about that. And they're going to have to be every single week show up and say, we've earned nothing. We're 0-0 right now and we have to go 1-0 and then just move on to the next week. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch that. Frankly, that's going to be the biggest thing. Mario Cristobal has done a ton of legwork in this program to take it to where it is right now. Now it's time to reap the rewards. Now it's time to take all of the recruiting and all of the building, and especially on the two offensive and defensive line, take all of that together and just go to work. The roster is awesome. The staff is really good. The NIL resources are off the charts. The energy around this program is better than it's been in a very, very long time. The time is now, period, end of story. It's one of those teams that you look at this year as maybe it's the end-all be-all for this iteration of Miami. If they don't perform this year, if they go 8-4, the criticism is going to be very, very loud. It's going to be just as loud as the people singing your praises right now. So I do think there's going to be this energy around Miami where if they execute, great. It's a rocket ship off to whatever they want to be. They can be one of the powerhouses of this sport if they use this as a launch pad. If they fall short, if they go 8-4 and they miss the mark a little bit, there's a reality where a lot of people come down on them maybe a little bit too hard, but it will change the way that this program is seen. So I think that's the thing that obviously is going to be huge for this team. And as Anthony just brought up, I mean, there were moments last year where Mario Cristobal just kind of got a little bit too involved, was just a little bit too in tune with a lot of the decision makings in game. And allowing his staff that I think is really, really strong and much better than it was when he started his time over in Miami, letting his staff just be his staff and call the plays and do everything that they need to do, I think is going to be hugely important for him. So that's another thing that he's going to have to kind of prove himself for this year, prove that not only is he someone that can win a ton of football games and do a lot of really good things on the field, but also he's someone that can kind of at certain points just put his hands behind his back and say, you guys know what you're doing. I fully trust you, and we're going to, land wherever we land with some of the guys that I have. So I think if you were talking about a pressure index going into this year, you'd find Miami anywhere between 2 and 5. I think Ohio State has number 1 locked up and no one's catching them. But I do think Miami is not too far behind there, and this is the year to execute. There's no two ways about that. I know Hurricane fans have been waiting quite some time to be an elite program, and everything's pointing in the right direction for this to be the year that starts the rocket ship that could be Miami football. So it'll be awesome to watch that team. If they win a ton of games, it could be tough to stop them in the future. If they, go 8-4, 7-5, it could mean Mario Cristobal is heading for a quick exit. Let's just put it at that. But we'll take our second break here, and when we come back, we're talking about recruiting. We'll get into Kalen DeBoer and how all of the doubters about him recruiting in the South were just plain wrong. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Miami and the expectations heading into this season. Anthony over here just said he'd be fine with 9 wins. I think that's a good moniker for this team. 9 wins or better is a huge win. Anything below that, you're probably asking a couple of questions. And now we'll get into recruiting. And Kalen DeBoer has been just incredible. It's been remarkable to watch what he's been able to do in a very short time as the head coach of Alabama, because every single thing you heard when Saban left was, this guy just can't do the job. Was Kalen DeBoer is walking into a situation that is impossible to succeed at. No one wants to fill the shoes of Nick Saban, and frankly, I'm surprised that there were, not as many people wanting to fill the shoes, because the infrastructure was incredible, and Kalen DeBoer is showing that in no uncertain terms right now. They are up to the number 1 class in the country. According to On3, they've signed 4 5-stars, and this is one of them. Caleb Cunningham is a huge wide receiver commit that just got to Alabama. 6'3", 190, a really, really long athletic guy that was really a Mississippi battle for quite some time. It was Ole Miss against Mississippi State, and then Auburn kind of find their way into the fray. This was a very interesting recruitment overall. He was someone that would go on a recruitment visit, that would be his top team, and then he would go on a recruitment visit the next week, and that would be his top team. So kind of a weird swinging pendulum type of recruitment, but Bama gets the commitment, and absolutely huge pickup for Jamarcus Shepard. I think he's building up a class that is going to have to play pretty early on. There's going to be some guys that leave from there at the wide receiver position, and he's doing a great job of making sure that they are absolutely ready for that moment. So I think that's an absolutely huge pickup. And then you got Ty Haywood coming in, a 5-star offensive tackle, 6'6", 300 pounds, just absolutely ridiculous. This dude is someone that, frankly, this was where I worried the most about Kalen DeBoer recruiting. I didn't necessarily worry about the wide receivers or about the quarterbacks or the running backs or really any offensive position overall, but I did worry about the lines of scrimmage. I thought there was going to be somewhat of a disconnect there, and it was going to be a little bit tougher to make that happen, especially with Scott Huff moving on to the NFL, who coached a fantastic offensive line at Washington a year ago. it hasn't been an issue at all. They've done an incredible job. Also added Michael Carroll, who's one of the top offensive tackles in the country as well. So it's just ridiculous what they've been able to do. And Anthony brings up a great point. Obviously, people were worried about the fan base and how they would kind of deal with some of the expectations this year, and frankly that's the biggest thing that I worry about with Bama going into this year is how do the fans handle 1 loss, 2 loss, maybe even 3 losses in the regular season. But that's something we can unpack throughout the season, and Bama's just been on a tear. I mean, they added Ty Haywood, obviously, Michael Carroll, Caleb Cunningham, Dijon Lee is a huge 5-star commit, Keelan Russell is a 5-star over on 247, not on On3, but frankly, he's a 5-star. I'll say that in my rankings, he's a 5-star because the dude is just out of this world good. And when you talk about this staff just doing absolute work, it goes no further than Courtney Morgan. He is so important. He is someone that is just as big of a person for the future of Alabama as really anyone in that building, and he's going to work. He's just done incredible work there and at Washington when he was there, and he's going to be a rising star in this sport. I can almost promise you that. Very, very interesting guy, and someone that I definitely think can make some noise. So I think, Anthony had a question here. Oh, he's talking about Kalen DeBoer recruiting in the South. Yeah, I think that was definitely a huge worry. I mean, you definitely, when you're coming from over in the Pacific Northwest, that's going to be a tough thing to do. I think the staff he put around him was the real difference. I think adding guys like Kane Womack, keeping Eddie Reese in the fray over there is absolutely huge to kind of create those roots. And at the end of the day, if you are someone that can connect with people, that can sell your vision, you're going to do a pretty good job on recruiting, and Kalen DeBoer is one of those guys. So he definitely did not come in with a lot of those Southern connections that a lot of the other coaches have thrived off of, but some other coaches have done that and have been able to do it, and it really just comes down to being able to sell the vision that you have and be able to sell it really well. But let's move on to some other commitments here and move off Bama here for a second. Jace Thomas is someone that is absolutely a huge pickup. A 4-star safety is committed to LSU. This is a guy that was out of Louisiana. He should not leave Louisiana. That is something that LSU has been struggling with just a little bit over the past couple of years, and they got to get back to just locking down that state overall. So I think one thing I've noticed is since Decoria Moore has decommitted from this class, it's been all about the defense for LSU. They absolutely attacked the defensive side of the ball and have done an incredible job. So it gives you an idea of how big those staff hires were for for Brian Kelly this past offseason, and it's definitely opened a lot of doors for them. And then you have Quanell Farrakhan Jr., a very, very talented wide receiver. He's committed to Colorado. This is someone that absolutely is going to play very, very early on for Colorado, and I think it's going to be just incredible to watch this guy develop into a really, really good player. And it's something that I've talked about a little bit before, but Colorado's dipping their toe into that recruiting, high school recruiting world just a little bit more every single year. And frankly, I don't think that's going to stop by any means, because I think it is going to be a really, really, really good recruiting world that Colorado's creating up there. But 1 second here, y'all. Yeah, I definitely think he definitely was not going to have trouble recruiting the offensive skill positions. There's no two ways about that. The defense will be interesting to watch, and Kane Womack will have to carry a lot of weight there. There's no two ways, but at the end of the day, I think they'll be more than fine on both sides of the ball as long as they're doing what they're doing right now, that's for sure. But Taz Williams is someone I want to talk about, a 4-star wide receiver. He's committed to Baylor. He's out of Red Oak, Texas, a very talented kid, and frankly, this was all Penn State. This was a Penn State recruitment for a very, very long time, and then Baylor just stole him. I don't know if anyone saw the quote from Dave Aranda talking about recruiting and why they're doing so well. He said they're paying players, and I don't know that that's what happened here. I'm sure there was more to it than that, but at the end of the day, you got to do what you got to do, and that's a huge pickup for him and definitely gives Baylor fans more to cheer about than they had about 2 seconds ago, that's for sure. And then we have Dalen Upshaw. He's committed to Miami. We talked about it earlier. Miami recruiting is something that is just going to be a huge part of pretty much every cycle at this point. Mario Cristobal absolutely knows how to recruit. There's no two questions about that. And as long as he's in town, as long as Miami is moving in the direction they're moving in, they'll be more than fine and could fill a wide receiver void that they might just have there in 2025. And then you had Michigan just continue to do work. They got in a wide receiver, Philip Wright III. They got him out of Louisiana, which is a wild, wild thing to me. I think when you come into Louisiana and beat out teams like LSU, beat out Georgia, who also had a offer out for Philip Wright, it's just insane. This staff is very much pushing themselves into being a big-time recruiting entity that they absolutely could have been for quite some time, but finally are turning that leaf a little bit more and really doing an incredible job. And then another wide receiver that came off the board was Travis Smith Jr. He's committed to Tennessee. He is out of Westlake High School in Atlanta, actually Cam Newton's alma mater, fun fact there, but a really, really elite wide receiver and someone that could step in for a Squirrel White or for a Brew McCoy next year, probably more a Brew McCoy, 6'4", 200 pounds. But at the end of the day, a very, very talented kid and someone that Josh Heupel is just going to continue to do work at those skill positions, especially wide receiver. And then we'll get back to T-Rob. The Charvarius Robinson, the safety and co-defensive coordinator over at Georgia, is doing work on the recruiting trail right now. Added Rashad Johnson, a big-time 4-star safety out of Bushnell, Florida. This guy is super, super talented. Someone that absolutely can make some noise. And this UGA back end is already really good. It's going to be scary good. And years to come, I can almost promise you that. So very, very excited for that. Yeah, DJ Pickett absolutely could be someone that if Miami picks him up, oh, they're off to the races. There's no two ways about that. That would be awesome to watch, and they're going to have to battle Oregon and LSU down the stretch a little bit here, but I like where Miami's sitting for that one. And then Nick Townsend is a 4-star tight end. He's committed to Texas, a huge pickup for this team, a 4-star or number 4 tight end in the 2025 class. Texas finally has recruiting momentum heading in the right direction. It used to, the last couple of weeks have not been very kind to them, but they finally got a couple of things moving in the right direction. Khalil Lockett also got a crystal ball to them, so finally Texas is finding their even keel and hopefully finding their way to getting a couple of big-time recruits here pretty soon, and Nick Townsend might just be the start of that. And then Tanook Hines, a very, very talented, very fast receiver, has committed to USC, and he is someone that I think right when Zachariah Branch walks out the door, Tanook Hines is going to walk in and take over that position. He is so, so fast and someone that absolutely could start immediately. And in that offense that our guy Lincoln Riley runs over there, it's going to be a lot of fun for him. I'll just put it that way. And then we had a couple of scheduled commitments that I want to break down for you all. Jared Smith is someone that's going to be huge for this class. He has decided to make his commitment on August 3rd, so coming up here pretty soon. It looks like it's going to be Auburn. Auburn has been leading with this one for quite some time. South Carolina is definitely pushing a good bit here, but it feels like Auburn's going to win out on this in-state product, 6'6", 250, so just a really, really long athletic kid that absolutely will play pretty early on during his time at Auburn. And then Michael Fasusi is someone we've talked about a lot, an elite offensive tackle, 5-star. He is going to commit on August 21st, so a little bit later down the road, but this guy is absolutely out of this world, the number 12 recruit in 2025. And someone that I think is going to be Texas. Texas has kind of been leading in this one for quite some time. A&M is right there as well. Oregon is pushing quite a bit, but I do think it's going to be Texas at the end of the day unless some team makes a big-time push late in this process. And then Julian Lewis, I feel like is someone we have to just be watching going forward because he's going to decommit. I feel very confident in that. I think he will not be a part of USC's class, and he might just be finding his way over to Colorado. That feels like the leader right now, although Indiana's making quite a push. So it'll be really interesting to watch this one. I lean towards the Buffs winning out on that one, but it'll be really interesting to watch. And then you got Penn State, and I want to talk about something that's happening around Penn State, and it's something that Josh Pate brought to my attention when I was watching his show. Penn State in 2022 got 6 of the top 11 players in the state. In 2023, they got 4 of the top 10. In 2024, they got 5 of the top 10. In 2025 so far, they have 2. They're number 9 and number 10. And they've lost out on guys like Matt Zollers, Andrew Olish, Michael Carroll, all to out-of-state schools that you don't want coming in. And then you lost to other top 10 players in that state to Ohio State, the team that you want to lose the recruits to the least, if I'm being totally honest. So Penn State's got to figure that out because like LSU, like we were talking about earlier, this is another team that needs to lock down that state. They need to control Pennsylvania recruiting or it could be a little bit tough to go out and battle those UGAs, those USCs across the country and do some of the things that you're going to have to do if you can't lock down that state. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch, not only this cycle, but going forward. Does James Franklin kind of have a problem on his hands locking down the state that should be really easy for Penn State to lock down, if I'm being totally honest? But it'll be really, really fun to watch recruiting blow up. As Anthony said here, we could be having Miami have one of the biggest recruiting days they've had in quite some time here pretty soon, but we'll keep you updated with everything as it happens. But we're going to take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the impact freshmen for the ACC. We've made our way through every single other conference, Big 12, Big 10, SEC. Now we're going to get into the ACC and break down some freshmen that I think are just going to be absolutely huge for these teams. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. To access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little update on recruiting. Alabama just continues to be on an absolute tear. Teams like Miami and Texas are definitely picking up some steam right about now, but let's get into the most impactful freshmen for all of the conference contenders in the ACC this time around. We've covered all the other conferences. Now it's time for the conference that has a lot of questions going into this year outside of the football field, but let's get into all of these big-time freshmen, and let's start with Landon Thomas. He is a tight end over at Florida State, and this guy's going to be huge for this team for so many different reasons, and I worry about this Florida State offense led by DJ just a little bit. I don't think he necessarily has the passing ability that Jordan Travis had. I don't necessarily think he's the most elite guy of throwing some of those passes that Mike Norvell really, really loves to have thrown. But at the end of the day, he loves his tight ends. There's no two ways about that. Velling over at Oregon State, who is now at Michigan State, was one of his favorite targets during his time there. And I think this is going to be the same thing for Landon Thomas. I think he's going to be absolutely huge for this team. And I think it's going to be someone that is going to be on the field quite a bit. I mean, they're going to have multiple tight end sets and something that Mike Norvell really, really likes to use, and it opens him up to be what makes him special, which is a pass catcher. So the Florida State offense has plenty of dudes at wide receiver with Hakeem Williams, Malik Benson, but the tight ends are going to be a real difference maker in this offense and really kind of open it up a little bit more. So definitely watching this guy very, very closely. That's no two ways about that. But then Bryant Wesco is probably the easiest choice on this list. He was the one that, outside of Jeremiah Smith, was making the most noise of the freshman wide receivers in the spring. He was someone that you heard about pretty much every second of the day if you were talking about Clemson football, because he's special. There's no two ways about that. The last couple of years, there has not been the recruiting efforts at the wide receiver position that Clemson has gotten used to a little bit, but this past year they really kind of got back on track. TJ Moore was another guy that they're bringing in that is going to be huge for this team, but I wouldn't be surprised if Bryant Wesco was trotting out with the starters to get off the first season against Georgia, and it would be really, really interesting to watch that, because I think this is a guy that not only is a really good receiver, but is someone that can totally open up this offense and maybe just be Cade Klubnik's favorite target. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch that. For Miami, I went a different direction than Anthony did. I went to Justin Scott. I think the D-line is one of those that I do think the front line is really, really solid at Miami, and I'm not necessarily super worried about those two guys doing a really good job in Barrow Jr. and C.J. Clark, but I do think they need a ton of depth. I think they're going to need to rotate guys in and out and be that dominant force, because when you have those guys on the lines of scrimmage and you can kind of utilize that throughout your season, rotating those guys in and out can only really help you, can only open up the ability for you to just bear down on the offensive line and make it really, really tough for them to recover every single play. So I think Justin Scott, Armando Blunt are going to be absolutely huge players for this team, just kind of filling in the gaps where Simeon Barrow Jr. or CJ Clark just can't quite. So I don't know if he's going to be a starter to start the season, and frankly, I think he probably won't, but I think at the end of the season, he very well could. He's going to be someone that is going to be huge for this team, and when you look at his athleticism at defensive tackle, it is no secret that he is going to be outright scary throughout his time at Miami. But let's move on to North Carolina State here, and Terrell Anderson is someone that I think is going to be hugely important for this team, and if McCall goes down, the answer is C.J. Bailey, and it's not even a question, but I'm going to go with Terrell Anderson right now because they did a great job of picking up big-time targets in the portal if you're talking about North Carolina State with Noah Rogers, with Justin Jolie. Kevin Concepcion was already there, so that's absolutely huge, but I think this is someone that is going to come on campus and maybe just kind of like we just talked about with Justin Scott on the defensive line, could kind of just fill in the gaps, be the person that if someone needs a breather, if someone needs a little bit of water during a drive, he can come in and make a couple of plays for them. So it's not necessarily that he's going to be a huge player for them or lead them in receiving by any means like that. I just do think he's going to be someone that's going to be very important for this team in terms of depth and in terms of keeping themselves as a potent offense, even when you lose some of those big-time receivers that you brought in through the portal and that tight end you brought in through the portal. So he's hugely important just to keep this offense as elite as it possibly can be going into this year. But let's move on to Louisville, and it's Trent Carter to me. I think I look at this defense, and I have a lot of questions, if I'm being totally honest, about this defense with a lot of different moving parts around it, but I think linebacker is the one that got hit the hardest, especially with Jalen Alderman finding his way over to Miami. You definitely have a void there that needs to be filled pretty much as quickly as possible, and it could be a freshman filling that role. And I think it's one of those positions, linebacker, that you will have those two guys that are your linchpins. You will have those two guys that will be out there pretty much every down, but rotation is huge, especially with a lot of these high, quick, fast-paced, no-huddle offenses that you're going to be facing. Keeping guys fresh is not an easy thing to do, especially at that linebacker position with so many responsibilities. So I think this is someone that maybe the snaps aren't, crazy plentiful, but at the end of the day, I do think he's going to be a big-time player for them and someone that absolutely could make a couple of plays that transform games, really. And then we'll move over to Virginia Tech, my favorite team in the ACC going into this year. But Andrew Hanchuk is a very, very good player. This is kind of like the Miami situation again. Anais Peoples is going to be an incredible player on that defensive line. Him coming over from Duke is absolutely huge. The depth is something that you're going to need to kind of build out throughout the year. And I think this is a guy that absolutely will be a part of that. I think Virginia Tech could flip just so many different things on their head, especially in the ACC, if that defensive side of the ball, particularly the defensive line, can come together the way they expect it to. Because if they can get that line of scrimmage depth, if they can get that push at that line of scrimmage, they're going to be really, really tough to beat, especially with a guy like Kyron Drones, pressing all the buttons and making all the decisions. So very excited about this team. I think this is a guy that might definitely won't start the season, but definitely can be someone that is rotational and only increases his snaps throughout the season. And then move on to SMU here. Kadavion Dotson is a very interesting guy because this is really just filling a need. He's not the most talented guy in this class. He's not the guy that I think they're looking at, super, super aggressively right now, but they need back-end help. There's no two ways about that, and sometimes you just need to find that diamond in the rough, that guy that comes in and you don't expect a ton from him in his freshman year, but is thrust into action and makes some plays, and that's kind of the way I'm going right here. I think this is someone that, although he's a young player, although he's someone that, is going to need to learn the ropes, and maybe that does cause a couple of troubles for SMU's defense in the back end throughout this year, he still can make some plays, and he can still play some really good football and then possibly develop into a fantastic player in 2025. So I think this is someone that is kind of out of just need more than anything else, but one way or another will be huge for this team. And then North Carolina, this one was relatively easy for me. I think Jordan Shipp, the wide receiver, is going to be huge. North Carolina needs weapons just badly. Tez Walker walking out the door after the last year was a big blow, and they knew it was coming. There's no two ways about that. But they are going to need some guys to step up. And I think Jordan Shipp, obviously being the top wide receiver in the last class, is going to be the guy that's looked on to do that. He's someone that, frankly, I think throughout his career could be one of the best receivers we've seen at UNC in quite some time. I think he has just elite talent and someone that can totally be in all the record books for UNC, but he's going to have to come along pretty quickly because they have some holes there that need to be filled by just better athletes, just guys that are a little bit more scary when you line up in front of them. So I think this is one of those guys and definitely will be someone that can open up this offense just that little bit more. And then finally, Syracuse. This one's a little bit easy to me. Yassine Willis is a running back that is going to be huge for this team. I thought about King Joseph Edwards, who, by the way, all-name team in college football there. But regardless, I do think with LaQuint Allen being the only running back that is really going to be carrying a lot of the weight, you need that change of pace. You need that counterpunch in your running back room, and the teams that have the most success on the ground have that guy. I think this could be that guy. He is a big back. He is someone that is going to bruise you quite a bit, and I think especially on a team when we watched what Kyle McCord was a year ago, there were some games where he was just not good. He was very flat and just did not perform the way that they needed him to. That's probably going to be the case at least 1 or 2 games this season, and they're going to have to really lean on that run game. That's where a guy like Willis is going to become a real option and someone that absolutely is going to have to come along pretty quickly because there's not a lot of other options at running back other than LaQuint Allen up there. So I think that's a guy that is definitely going to be that third down back, that goal line back, whatever you need him to be. He's just going to fill in the gaps where LaQuint Allen just needs a little bit of a breather. So that'll be a really fun thing to watch. And the ACC overall, I don't think will be defined by freshmen the same way the SEC or the Big Ten will be, but there's still some guys that absolutely will be making some noise. Anthony brings up a great point. Elijah Lofton is another one that's absolutely going to make noise for Miami. Justin Scott is someone that I'm kind of just leaning on, needing that depth and him kind of just playing out of his mind really early on. So that might just be a little bit more projection more than anything else. But Elijah Lofton's another fantastic choice among a number of just ridiculous freshmen all across the ACC. But let's take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to do a Top 10 Tuesday. We're going to break down first my preseason top 10, but also the biggest games I have for those preseason teams and the games that I think are just going to define their season the most. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did our final most impactful freshman for every big time conference contender. We went through all of the Power 4 conferences and broke down all of those, and that was a very fun segment. So if you want to go check out the other segments, definitely go do that. But let's get into a Top 10 Tuesday now, and I'm going to give you my preseason Top 10 to start, but then we're going to get into the biggest games for those preseason Top 10 teams. And this doesn't necessarily mean the biggest game in terms of fandom or in terms of TV sales or in terms of the hype going into it. It's just where I think the hinge point is in their season, where I think the biggest game is in terms of so many different things, whether it's this season, next season, a legacy type pick. There are a ton of different things in here, and I'll explain them as we go. But let's start at number 10. And I have Utah as my number 10 team, and I think at Oklahoma State is the game. On September 21st, they travel to Stillwater and play under the darkest sky in America. It is going to be absolutely crazy, and I think this is the moment that Utah can kind of plant their flag in this conference. They're coming in as the big-time favorite. They're coming in as the team that everyone thinks is going to win this conference. Well, this would be the moment that either Oklahoma State can kind of put them in their place a little bit, or Utah can, confirm all that for all of us and make it known that this is their conference until further notice, because they would be walking into, frankly, the toughest place to play in the Big 12 for quite some time in Oklahoma State. And then you have, if Utah wins this game, they will have a ton of slack. The schedule in front of them after this game is not very tough. And I think with this conference, there's going to be a ton of two-loss teams in these conference games that it's going to be really, really interesting to see how the tiebreakers work out at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, if Utah does win this game, the amount of slack they'll have to get to Arlington will be plenty. I'll just put it that way. But then number 9, I have Penn State there, and it's at USC. I know that sounds a little bit crazy because obviously they want to beat Michigan and Ohio State more than they want to beat any other team on the schedule. But I do think this one's huge. I think when you travel to USC being late in the process of kind of building out that defense that they're going to be doing this year, and then you have that perfect storm of heading into a 2-game stretch of at Wisconsin and Ohio State, you got to win this one. You just have to, because you could be going into a stretch where maybe you split those games, maybe you lose both of those games, but at the end of the day, if you start off with a win, you give yourself at least a fighting shot to stay in this playoff race. So that's going to be a huge game on October 12th, and I think it's one that might be, Penn State might walk in and totally win by, 20 points, but I could also see a reality where USC ends up playing better defense than we expect them to play, and makes this game really interesting. So I think this is a game that maybe won't be the most interesting for Penn State fans when you look at the schedule, but is going to be huge for this team to get a win in this game. And then Missouri at Texas A&M, I think, is absolutely huge for them, and this is kind of where it falls on the schedule as well. They are going into a stretch of Auburn, at Bama, and OU after this game, and you got to walk in there with a win. You just have to. It's going to be so tough to come out of there with any chance to go to the playoff or especially go to the SEC title if you do not go into Kyle Field and get that win. It's going to be absolutely huge for this team, and frankly, A&M is that team that I'm watching to sink someone's chances in the SEC, whether it is Missouri or LSU or Texas at the end of the season. They feel like a team that is going to ruin some fun for someone, and it's going to be really interesting to watch who that team would be, but it definitely could be this Missouri team, and it's a remarkably tough place to play, but with everything coming up on the schedule after this game, Missouri definitely needs this one. And then I'm going to stay right there in Kyle Field for the next one. I think this Notre Dame game is huge, and I think they are the number 7 team in the country. This one's going to be very, very interesting because it is the first game of the season. It's hard to say that this is the most important game of the season, but when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, they do have Florida State, they do have Louisville. I think that Georgia Tech game is very interesting, and they're going to want to be a little bit more careful about that one than some people might think right now, but I think that game in Kyle Field is going to define their season, because if you start 0-1, I think you've lost all of your slack. I think a 10-2 season would put you right on the bubble in the playoff, and a 9-3 season would outright bury you. A win here is just absolutely huge. It's something that I don't necessarily know if they need to make the playoff, but if they don't get it, then they might just have to run the table to make the playoff. So I think this is one of those games that, yes, it is at the beginning of the season, and yes, it won't necessarily define who Notre Dame is as a team throughout the season, but it could define their playoff chances at the end of the day, and that would be a very, very interesting thing to watch. So I know it's a week 1 game, but I'm leaning into Texas A&M being Notre Dame's biggest game this upcoming season. Ole Miss, for me, it's at LSU. I think there's a number of energy, or there's so much energy around that UGA and that Bama game, and I totally understand it. That's the games that could, anoint them into the higher level of the SEC, but also this is a game that can do that. The teams that have been at the top of the SEC for quite some time, beat teams like LSU consistently, and not necessarily every single year, because that's just ridiculous. No one can really do that, but beating them 2 out of the 3 years is huge for some of these teams like Alabama to kind of keep that sustained success. Beating that team, LSU, has been one of the biggest things that they've done on a consistent basis, and if they can do it over there in Ole Miss, then they're starting to make their way up into that Alabama, Georgia conversation, rather than being in that kind of middle of the pack that is somewhat of a nightmare to be in the SEC. So that one is definitely the one that I think Ole Miss just absolutely needs a win, and they got one last year, but definitely got some luck in their direction in that game. But moving on to number 5, I do have Alabama as my number 5 team. At Tennessee is the one that I'm circling. Everyone will circle UGA, and I totally get that, and it is absolutely huge for this team. But when I look at that game, I don't necessarily think Alabama's going to win, and I don't necessarily think that kills them if they lose, because I do think there's a certain energy that, Bama doesn't want to lose that game. I'm not saying that, but I do think fans kind of understand where they're at, and they kind of understand that Georgia is coming in as the favorite. They are coming in as the team with a little bit more stability, so although that's going to be a game that is going to be blown out to the nth degree and be just absolutely huge for that team, I think Tennessee is the one that could make or break their season. They have a run at Tennessee, Missouri, at LSU. Starting that with a win gives you a ton of slack going into that back end of that season, and when you have Missouri coming to town, you got to feel confident about that one. So you got to continue that domination in that third week of October. It's obviously something that's very tough, and Tennessee very much wants to get that win for the second time in 3 years. But at the end of the day, this is the one for me that if Bama loses it, I think they're not a playoff team. If they win it, I think they're very much in that conversation. And then number 4, I do have Texas as my number 4 team. I have Oklahoma here. And again, UGA would be the normal answer here. But at the end of the day, I do think there's a ton of things going into this game. Obviously, losing a year ago to OU is going to be a thorn in Texas' side. They do not want that to happen again. They are going to do everything in their ability to make that not happen again. So that obviously adds to this, of course. But also, it's right after, the UGA game is right after this one. This is a very, very tough 2-week stretch. They are going into a 2-week stretch that is maybe one of the tougher of the entire college football season, and you got to make sure that you're ready to go during that game. You have to make sure that whether you are, going into a game, I might have that flipped, actually. They might play Georgia earlier. I can't remember. But at the end of the day, this is a 2-game stretch that you need to at least split. And Oklahoma, I would argue, is the more important one to win, in my opinion, because you lost it last year, because it's a rivalry, and because I don't think there's too many people that are really expecting Texas to beat Georgia. But at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be a huge win, whether it's coming off a big win against Georgia or going into a big game against Georgia. I think it's going to be a game that Texas just needs to put in the win column. And then Oregon, this one is a very easy one. Ohio State is obviously the biggest game on the schedule for them, and it's the moment. It's the moment where Dan Lanning and this team that has so much hype going into this season, that wants to do so many different things, confirms all of those things, confirms all of the hype around them, confirms that they are a team that is going to be a problem in the Big Ten going forward. And this would be a huge statement to make. There's no two ways about that. So I think if Oregon's going to take over the conference in year one, this would be where they would make that statement. They don't necessarily need to win it to make the Big Ten championship, but it would go a really, really long way and would definitely make them the team to beat. There's no two ways about that. And then number 2, easiest one on here. Ohio State has to beat Michigan. Period. End of story. If they don't win this game, whether they walk in 11-0 or they walk in 5-7 or 5-6, you got to win this game. This is the game for this team this upcoming year, and Sherrone Moore is coming in trying to ruin that. And it'll be really interesting to see if he can. I mean, he's seen the blueprint the last 3 years of how to go at this team and how to beat this team, and it'll be really, really interesting to watch. But this is without question the biggest game for Ohio State this upcoming year, and it's without question maybe the biggest game for any singular team this upcoming year, because if they lose this game 4 years in a row, there is going to be some Ohio State fans that they're going to do some things that are going to be questionable by law. I'll just put it that way. It's going to be a crazy, crazy time up there in Columbus, and I can almost promise you they will not want Ryan Day as their head coach going forward. I can say that pretty confidently. So that's obviously the biggest game, maybe of the entire year, but definitely for Ohio State. And then finally, Georgia's my number one team. At Bama is the game. This one's very easy. In my opinion, it's one of the biggest games of the year and could be one of the most defining games in the next 5 years of the SEC, because I think this is the game where maybe it's the passing of the torch, the official, Georgia taking over this conference and being the team to beat, and Bama kind of taking that little bit of a step back and becoming that tier 2 team that is fighting like LSU, like Ole Miss, like some of those other teams. So this could be the moment that Georgia fans have waited for quite some time, because Saban just kept beating them. But at the end of the day, September 28th is going to be a huge day. It could be the passing of the torch. It could be Bama saying, nah, we're just going to keep it for quite some time now. So it will be really, really interesting to watch that game. And I think when I look at this season and I'm trying to get the most excited for one game in particular, it might just be this one. I think this is the one that I think, between atmosphere and anger and the stakes behind it, this one just hits a little bit different than all the other ones on the schedule. So very, very excited about that one. And I think Georgia, you got to get the win. If you can get the win, then the SEC is effectively yours and you can hold on to it for quite some time. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.